Welcome to Respiration Part 1. Now, respiration is all about how a cell utilizes blood glucose. So we start then at the cell membrane, and glucose will enter the cell membrane through a number of facilitated diffusion transporters, which are called GLUT transporters. And there are 6 different transporters that can be found in different cells around the body. Now, the glucose is, of course, taken from a capillary, which would run alongside the cell, and that's represented here. And the glucose will enter the cell through the GLUT transporter by facilitated diffusion. Now, this is significant because it means that it will go along a concentration gradient. However, if the cell doesn't require the glucose and the concentration builds such that the concentration gradient no longer is allowing glucose into the cell, then glucose can also exit through the same transporters. So basically, it can go either way. But if the cell needs the glucose, then the first step of glycolysis is key, because the first step of glycolysis uses an ATP and converts that to ADP, and a phosphate is given to glucose, and it forms glucose 6-phosphate. So let's take a second to think about what that means. So glucose, as you know, is a ring structure, and the carbons of that ring structure are numbered going clockwise from the oxygen. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the first phosphate will go here. Now that's really important because glucose 6-phosphate isn't glucose, which sounds like a completely stupid thing to say, but it's not glucose, and therefore it doesn't contribute to the glucose diffusion gradient. So by converting glucose into glucose 6-phosphate, glucose can diffuse into the cell rapidly. So if you have a cell which is using a lot of energy, so say you're running and one of your muscle groups requires a huge amount of energy, then glucose can enter the cell and be used or turned into glucose 6-phosphate. It's trapped in the cell. Glucose 6-phosphate can't be transported by the GLUT transporters, and it means that more glucose can enter the cell by diffusion very rapidly. So the next step is slightly more complicated because it involves a bit of a shape change. And the next step is conversion to what in A level you need to know as hexose 6-phosphate. And what's really happening is a bit of a rearrangement. So the glucose is being converted into a fructose. So the only real difference between glucose and fructose is that there are only 4 carbons in the ring, meaning that there are now 2 carbons that are on almost side chains. And remember, the 6th carbon is still phosphorylated, and it means that now you have a molecule that is slightly more symmetrical. So the next step in glycolysis is the next step, which involves ATP. So this is the second investment step, where a cell is committing an ATP and converting to ADP. And it makes something called hexose 1,6 bisphosphate. And most importantly, that now is a completely symmetrical molecule. And there is a phosphate on either end of the molecule, meaning that it can be divided into 2 quite neatly.